Born on July 22, 1822 in a rural setting in Silesia, Austrian Empire, Gregor Johann Mendel started his unique and outstanding life. Mendel was a genius who could hold up his head at the age of 3, according to a Chinese YouTuber who slipped off his tongue, well actually on day 3 after birth. At the age of 11, Mendel was sent to school by his parents, since a local priest who recognized his academic abilities persuaded his parents to do so. After completing his gymnasium studies in 1840, he was enrolled in a 2-year program in philosophy at Olmütz University, where he excelled in physics and mathematics. Mendel's initial years away from home were hard, and his family could not sufficiently afford his study. He worked as a tutor for other students to cover his expenditure. He suffered depression twice, which forced him to return home to recover. Mendel graduated in 1843. Rather than taking over his family's farm, he preferred a different solution to his predicament, choosing to enter the Otbrunn monastery as a novitiate of the Augustinian order. The move to the monastery took him to Brunn, the capital of Moravia. He was also introduced to a diverse and intellectual community. As a priest, Mendel found his parish duty to visit the sick and dying people so distressing that he again fell ill. Abbot Cyril Knapp found him a substitute teaching position, but Mendel failed the exam for teacher certification and was sent to the University of Vienna for 2 years to benefit from a new program of scientific instruction. Mendel devoted his time to physics and mathematics, working under Doppler and Eddinghausen. He also studied the anatomy and philosophy of plants and the use of the microscope under botanist Franz Unger, whose writing attracted attack from the Roman Catholic press shortly before and during Mendel's time there. In the summer of 1853, Mendel returned to the monastery in Brunn. He was again given the teaching position. Unfortunately, he failed the exam for certification again. However, these years were still his greatest in terms of success, both as a teacher and a consummate experimentalist. In 1854, Abbot Cyril Knapp permitted Mendel to plan a major experimental program in hybridization at the monastery. The aim of this program was to trace the transmission of the hereditary characters in successive generations of hybrid progeny. Previous authorities had observed that progeny of the fertile hybrids tended to revert to the originating species, and they had therefore concluded that hybridization could not be a mechanism used by nature to multiply species. Though in exceptional cases, some fertile hybrids did appear not to revert. On the other hand, plant and animal breeders had long shown that crossbreeding could indeed produce a multitude of new forms. Mendel chose to conduct his studies with the edible pea because of the numerous distinct varieties, the ease of culture and control of pollination, and a high proportion of successful seed germinations. From 1854 to 1856, he tested 34 varieties for constancy of their traits. In order to trace the transmission of characters, he chose 7 traits that were expressed in a distinctive manner, such as plant height and seed color. He first established pea lines with 2 different forms of one feature, such as tall versus short. He grew these lines for generations until they always produced offspring identical to the parent, which was defined as pure breeding. He bred them each other and counted the exact number of plants that showed each trait. The form of a feature, tall, concealed the other form, short, in the first generation after the cross. Mendel called the visible form, tall, the dominant trait, and the hidden form, short, the recessive trait. In the second generation, after plants were allowed to self-fertilize, the hidden form of the trait reappeared in a minority of the plants. Specifically, there were always about 3 plants that showed the dominant trait for every 1 plant that showed the recessive trait, making a 3-to-1 ratio. He referred to these alternatives as contrasted characters, or character pairs. Mendel also found that the features were inherited independently. One feature, such as height, did not influence inheritance of other features, such as seed color. As a consequence, he discovered the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment. In that era, before molecular biology was introduced, the concepts like character pairs were difficult to understand and even beyond human imagination. Today, we find it easy to understand Mendel's experiments and to explain the results with genetics. But think about this. If you don't even have any idea about what genes are, well, you can't even imagine that there's something called genes. Can you still come up with the idea to let plants self-fertilize for many generations in order to get pure breeding parents? Can you explain why the second generation was showing a 3-to-1 ratio? Mendel could do all of these, and he was an excellent biologist. Mendel presented his paper, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, in 2 meetings of the Natural History Society of Brünn in Moravia in 1865. It generated a few favorable reports in local newspapers, but was ignored by the scientific community. When Mendel's paper was published in 1866, it was seen as essentially about hybridization rather than inheritance, had little impact, and was only cited about 3 times over the next 35 years. Even Mendel's friend, one of the leading biologists at that time, Carl Nägeli, failed to appreciate Mendel's discoveries. During Mendel's lifetime, most biologists held the idea that all characteristics were passed to the next generation through blending inheritance, in which the traits from each parent are averaged. Instances of these phenomena are now explained by the action of multiple genes with quantitative effects. Mendel's scientific biography thus provides an example of the failure of obscure, highly original innovators to receive the attention they deserve. In 1900, 3 botanists, De Vries, Correns, and Seysseniec, independently reported results of hybridization experiments similar to Mendel's. They claim not to have known Mendel's work when doing their own experiments. Some scientists questioned Mendel's experiments. After all, the description of forms of a feature, such as tall and short, green and yellow, are not based on a universal criterion. They analyzed the result of the second filial generation and found the ratio of the dominant trait to the recessive trait implausible, too close to the expected ratio of 3-to-1. It was suspected that the data in most of Mendel's experiments had been falsified to meet Mendel's expectations. This explanation invokes a phenomenon called the confirmation bias. Once Mendel became the abbot of the monastery in 1868, his administrative duties came to occupy the majority of his time. He was overburdened and his scientific work largely ended. Moreover, Mendel's refusal to permit the monastery to pay the state's new taxes for a religious fund led to his involvement in a long and bitter dispute with the authorities. Convinced that this tax was unconstitutional, he continued his opposition, refusing to comply even when the state took over the administration of some of the monastery's estates and directed the profit to the religious fund. Mendel died on January 6, 1884, at the age of 61. After his death, the succeeding abbot burned all papers in Mendel's collection to mark an end to his disputes over taxation. In addition to his experiments with edible peas, Mendel also did many other researches. He first planned to use mice to start his studies on heredity when he was at St. Thomas Abbey, but the bishop did not like animal experiments, so Mendel switched to plants. He also bred bees in a bee house that was built for him, using beehives that he designed. He also studied astronomy and meteorology, to which the majority of his published works were related. Later after his lifetime, he was known as the father of genetics, yet he was a lifelong learner, a scientist, and a man of faith.